After finishing my rewatch of Kamen Rider Black Sun, I noticed how divisive the show's reception has been amongst Tokusatsu fans outside of Japan, especially with regards to it not fitting the mold of its legendary inspiration, Kamen Rider Black. And I get it, because nothing can ever replace this. But I honestly feel that a great deal of the fan base is missing the point of the show, and contrary to popular opinion, it's not trying to go out of its way to placate us Western liberals with pointless edginess. It's very much aimed at Japan's boomers and Gen Xers who experienced both the show and Japan's continued political and socio-economic decline firsthand. So for today's video, I'm actually going to dive into the hidden meanings and messages, both political and otherwise, in Kamen Rider Black Sun, with the hope that if you were kind of miffed about your initial viewing of the show, then maybe after watching this video, you might give it a second chance. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about the politics of Kamen Rider Black Sun. Let's go. Now before I get into any spoilers, I do want to give out some initial thoughts about the show. And overall, I love it. It's got a great cast, it's got great effects, and the fights are sweet, simple, and savage. Kind of like a cross between Kamen Rider Kuga and Ginga Man. The only real issues I had with the show is that its kaijin world building between 1936 and 1972 needed to be fleshed out a bit better, and a few more episodes could have helped with this, especially with regards to the kaijin village. But overall, I think it's must-see tokusatsu, and I'm really glad that Kazuya Shiraishi and company kind of went all out with this. Now, if you're avoiding Kamen Rider Black Sun due to its heavy dose of Japanese politics, I've got 4 films that I think will be really good to help you digest all of Black Sun's themes. And the first one I've got for you is actually a tokusatsu film, and that film is Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack from 2001, directed by Gamera veteran Shusuke Kaneko. It's a great film with fantastic special effects and tension, but the most relevant bit about the film with regards to Black Sun is that in this film, Godzilla is a supernatural entity who's made up of all the souls that were vanquished by Imperial Japan during World War II. Unfortunately, in this movie, modern day Japan has all but forgotten the war, and therefore Godzilla actually re-emerges to teach the nation a very, very horrible lesson. It's a very on-the-nose film here, but it does make for great and relevant viewing before you check out Black Sun. Now the next film rec I have for you guys is the indie martial arts film Kuro Obi or Black Belt from 2007, helmed by Shinichi Nagasaki. It's a fantastic film that features 3 karate practitioners from the 1930s whose lives are turned upside down once their training hall and way of life is co-opted by Japan's imperial war machine. It's a sobering martial arts tale that you can easily see nowadays, so don't miss out on it. And for those of you that love Kamen Rider trivia, Kuro Obi's director is actually married to Kaori Mizushima, who's pretty much everyone's favorite scientist on Kamen Rider Kuga, Hikari Inokida. Now the third film rec I have is probably the most important with regards to Black Sun, and that's the 2018 documentary called Shusenjo, directed by Miami native Miki Dezaki. It's a deep dive into the Japanese government's reluctance to take legal responsibility for its use of comfort women in World War II, and the denialism surrounding the issue, thanks in no small part to Japan's leading political party, the LDP. This film made such a huge uproar in Japan that it was actually barred from film festivals, and Miki Dezaki was actually sued by a few right-wing celebrities in the process. However, Shusenjo does enjoy a very good following, and it was actually even recognized by Kamen Rider Black Sun's director, Kazuya Shiraishi himself. I'll be making a few references to Miki Dezaki's work throughout this video, so if you get the chance, definitely rent or buy Shusenjo on Amazon today. And the last film that I've got for you in preparation of Kamen Rider Black Sun is the 2020 film Wife of a Spy, directed by Japan's horror master, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who was responsible for such classics like Cure and Pulse. It gets the nod from me because it centers on a housewife whose whole worldview is challenged when her husband returns from a business trip in China with paranoia, another woman, and a mysterious roll of film that might implicate the nation's involvement in war crimes. It's must-see stuff, so don't sleep on it. Now that we got all of that out of the way, let's talk spoilers and let's get into the meat here and talk about the politics of Kamen Rider Black Sun. Part 1, the Korean Kawasaki connection. Lots of folks have already made mention about Black Sun's inspirations, especially in regards to the demonstration scene in the show. From George Floyd to Black Lives Matter, these are bold depictions, and for a Japanese TV show, this is unprecedented. But this is especially true for Japanese viewers from the city of Kawasaki. Yasumichi Noma of the Counter-Racist Action Collective did a live stream on his YouTube channel in November of 2022 to discuss the real-life parallels between the city of Kawasaki and Kamen Rider Black Sun. And if you check it out here and here, we can tell that Black Sun's production crew filmed in the heart of Kawasaki. Kawasaki is a well-known city in Kanagawa Prefecture, which isn't too far away from Yokohama and Tokyo, and is home to a sizable population of both South Korean immigrants and Zainichi Koreans, who are descendants of the thousands of forced laborers brought over to the island during Imperial Japan's occupation of the Korean peninsula. In 2015, hate groups poured into Kawasaki, targeting its Korean population with racist chants and signs. This galvanized a huge swath of anti-racist activists in the area, and showdowns and standoffs soon became commonplace between 2015 to 2020. And if you look closely at the anti-racism demonstrators, you'll notice that they very much look like what we saw in Black Sun, especially with regards to the yellow slogans and attire. It's my thinking that Shiraishi chose these motifs not only because these anti-racist demonstrators made huge headlines across Japan, but because Kawasaki was the first ever city in Japan to enact the Hate Speech Elimination Act in December 2019, which went into full effect in July 2020. Now, even though other cities in Japan have hate speech ordinances, Kawasaki's is the very first to actually levy criminal fines and penalties. However, if you take a look at the table here, the ordinance still needs a lot more teeth since you can easily find a ton of loopholes here. But given how normalized racism is in Japan via erasure, blackface, and anti-immigrant hate speech, the Hate Speech Elimination Act is still a watershed moment in the fight against racism in Japan. Now, speaking of racists, the Counter-Racist Action Collective also made a comment about Wataru Igaki, who's our chief racist on Kamen Rider Black Sun. And from their point of view, he's clearly a parody of Makoto Sakurai, who, let's just say, is an abominable human being who not only engages in hate speech regularly against Zainichi Koreans, but is the head of the Japan First Party, which obviously takes inspiration from Donald Trump. Now, I won't platform any of Makoto's nonsense here on this video, but if you want to learn more about how he's trying to ruin Japan, you can definitely check out Vox's 2017 video about right-wing nationalism featuring Johnny Harris. Lastly, before I move on to the next subject, I do want to mention something that I noticed in Black Sun, and that's the solidarity that the show's kaijins have with Zainichi Koreans. In episode 1, we're taken to Samezu Yokocho, which is kind of like a drinking alleyway that isn't only a home to both Aoi and Shunsuke, but it's a home to many disenfranchised people in the area. This is literally the only locale in the show where you can see Korean-owned stores, snacks, and yes, even Aoi's guardian Misaki Izumi is a Zainichi Korean, judging by the store she owns and the various hanbok she has in her residence. For those of you that don't know, hanbok is traditional Korean attire. Oh, and if you're wondering why I mentioned Misaki as a Zainichi Korean, even though her last name is Japanese, please take note that it was very common for ethnic Chinese and Korean residents to take up Japanese surnames as legal aliases to avoid discrimination. And since many Zainichi Korean males are barred from regular work and are kind of forced to take up either yakuza work, hard labor, or even construction jobs, it's my hunch that Shunsuke's human father is Zainichi Korean as well. Now, if you're looking for a more hidden shout out to Zainichi Koreans overall, check out Kamen Rider Black Sun's Little Protest Girl in episode 10, where the sign that she's holding is directly referencing a sign used in Tokyo's Koreatown called Shin-Okubo, which basically experienced a months-long standoff between hate mobs and anti-racist activists in 2013. And for those of you viewers out there that are of Korean heritage, you'll notice that this little girl's protest sign is bordered by the colors of South Korea's national symbol, the three-colored taeguk, with blue representing heaven, red representing earth, and yellow representing humanity. It's an amazing show of solidarity that will fly over our heads unless we're really paying attention, especially if you consider that anti-Korean hatred in Japan looks like this.
A lot of people in Japan call disposable cameras baka-chon cameras. Baka means stupid or idiot, and chon is a derogatory term for Korean people. So the term baka-chon camera means a camera so easy to use that even an idiot or a Korean person can use it.
Part 2, Generations of Doom. Now, in my opinion, what sets Kamen Rider Black Sun apart from a lot of Tokusatsu shows and possibly some Japanese television overall is its overt disdain over two prime ministers, namely Michinosuke Donami and his grandson Shinichi. It's very clear that both are stand-ins for former post-war Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi and his recently assassinated grandson, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, both of whom are from the LDP. The show does a great job in not only lampooning both Abe and Kishi, but does it without whitewashing their legacy. Now, Shinichi is pretty much a spot-on parody of Shinzo Abe in that he's a corrupt asshole who profits off his connections, and since he's a businessman, so to speak, he views everyone as a disposable commodity. He knows how to avoid criticism, he doesn't care about the rule of law or due process, and like Shinzo Abe, he's got conservatism baked into his genes. One of the most glaringly evil moments of Black Sun is when he reviews how he makes Heat Heaven, where he mentions that its human ingredients are made up of welfare recipients, the elderly, and members of the LGBTQ community who aren't reproducing. This is very much in line with views espoused by prominent real-life LDP politicians like Taro Aso, Kazuo Yana, Yoshitaka Sakurada, who was the former cybersecurity minister who once famously said that he's never used a computer in his entire life, and most notably, lower house member Mio Sugita, who made headlines when she said this in 2015.
生産性がない同性愛の人たちに皆さんの税金を使って支援をするどこにそういう大義名分があるんですか、この LGBT の知識を学校教育で教えるべきかどうかっていうことに対しての意見をくださいというふうに言われまして、私は当然そんなものは必要ありません。それはそうですね。はい。その同性愛の子供は普通に正常に恋愛ができる子供に比べて自殺率が6倍高いんだと、それでもあなたは必要ないって言うんですかみたいなことを言われまして、そんな思春期の時期にですね、いや女性が女性を好きになるのはおかしくないですよ、男性が男性好きなのはおかしくないですよ、もっと皆さん堂々と胸を張ってそんな縮こまらずに同性愛の人もちゃんと胸を張ってましょうっていう教育したらどうなりますかって、はい、ちゃんと正常に戻っていける部分を戻っていけなくなってしまいますよねっていう。
But an even bigger monster here on Kamen Rider Black Sun is Michinosuke Donami, Shinichi's grandfather. Now we all know that he was the one responsible for creating the unit that created Kaijins, and we all know that he was a very evil prime minister in Black Sun. But what's really surprising for me is how little Black Sun really delves into actual history, because if you ever look into the history of his inspiration, Nobusuke Kishi, you're gonna realize that Black Sun really doesn't dig deep enough in that regard, because Nobusuke Kishi is literally the personification of evil. I mean, he's so bad that in Japan, he's literally called Showa no Yokai, okay? Literally the monster of the Showa era. To understand why Kishi's so evil, we need to rewind a bit back to the 1930s. After a series of economic and military victories in the 20th century, Imperial Japan embarked on its plan to go deeper into Asia by creating the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeastern China. Established as a totalitarian state, the Imperial Japanese Army envisioned Manchukuo to be the military-industrial heartland of the empire. But the empire needed a hardline bureaucrat to run it, and Nobusuke Kishi was chosen to become the Deputy Minister of Industrial Development. From there, Kishi exploited Korean and Chinese factory workers with forced labor, created mass graves for workers that died of illness and exhaustion, oversaw a police state that tortured prisoners, took land away from farmers and gave them to Japanese colonizers, and facilitated one of the worst human rights violations in the region, Unit 731, led by Army Dr. Shiroishi. As some of you have already learned, Unit 731 was a covert research and development unit that focused on chemical and biological warfare. Chinese locals and others were subjected to horrors like vivisection, amputation, hypothermia, rape, forced pregnancies, and weapons testing. And yes, they experimented on children as well. It's estimated that more than 500,000 people died under the experiments of Unit 731, and there were no survivors. This was literally a death sentence for weapons research, and the irony of it all is that none of these bastards were ever tried of war crimes. Much of that is down to the fact that after the Allies occupied Japan, the US made a plea deal with the Unit 731 scientists, where the US would offer them full immunity if they gave up all their research to the US, which is not too dissimilar to Operation Paperclip. At this point, you might be wondering, if Michinosuke Donami is so terrible, how in the hell did he become Prime Minister in Black Sun in the first place? Because that's not really explained. Well, it's my belief that Kazuya Shiraishi is betting on people's memories of Kishi to kind of fill in the gaps, so allow me to explain. By the time the Allies won, Nobusuke Kishi was sent to the slammer as a Class A war criminal, the highest designation you could ever get. However, the USA had other ideas. With China now under the reign of Mao Zedong, the US was in Cold War mode and needed an Asian ally. To them, Kishi, a staunch anti-communist, was their best bet to eventually lead Japan, and in 1948 he was released from prison, received full immunity, and was never tried of any war crimes. In 1952, the American occupation of Japan ended, which also lifted that pesky ban that withheld former Imperial Japanese officers from getting back into politics. This was good for Kishi because the party that would eventually become the LDP was getting a ton of campaign funds, with the CIA being one of its best backers. And by January of 1957, Kishi soon became Prime Minister, and the rest is history. Up history. From Unit 731 to Shinzo Abe, Kamen Rider Black Sun is probably the only TV show I've ever seen from Japan that's willing to kind of lampoon and kind of criticize these dark moments in Japanese history with a refreshing mixture of satire and anger. And the fact that they've accomplished this by lampooning two former prime ministers is commendable, not only because both are adored by Japan's conservatives, but also because Abe was himself assassinated last year. And the show thankfully didn't censor itself when the same fate befell Shinichi Donami. Now, it's common to see art imitating life outside of Japan, but to see it done so well in the context of Japan's conservative TV climate feels like a once-in-a-lifetime event, and to have that in a tokusatsu drama of all things is kind of surreal. Part 3, Groovy, Gorgom. Now that we're done talking about the Donamis, let's switch gears to Gorgom, because I really dug that they were a hip leftist student organization in the 70s. It's obvious that Goryu Gorgomu was inspired by the real-life Zenkyoto demonstrations that happened throughout the 60s and 70s as young folks from all over Japan marched for better working conditions, socialist reforms, and, more importantly, to vent their frustrations at Prime Minister Kishi, who wanted to revise Japan's constitution to remilitarize, which shouldn't be a surprise given that in World War II, Kishi co-signed the declaration of war against the US. Gorgom even does a kidnapping just like the United Red Army did, one of Japan's most notorious left-wing groups from that era. However, everything changes once Darom strikes that deal giving Kaijin short-term rights in exchange for their continued subjugation as weapons of war. Now, I won't go into the details of how shit went sideways for Gorgom, or for Buildup, for our two riders, or for Yukari, because all of that was very heartbreaking in the show. But I do want to give a shout out to one of the most underrated characters of Black Sun, and that's Oliver. He, above everyone else, kept me invested in the fate of Gorgom, and I can't imagine how lonely an existence he must have had, not only as a black man in Japan, but as the only guy left from Gorgom that stayed true to their original mission from 1972 up until his death in 2003 at the hands of Buildup and Donami. If anything, he's the unsung hero of the show. After Darom's deal with Donami, the Creation King came under the LDP's jurisdiction, and under Michinosuke's guidance, Gorgom became a political party. Now, contrary to popular opinion, Gorgom isn't the ruling party here in Kamen Rider Black Sun, and that's not the party that Donami belongs to, because frankly, that doesn't make sense. In Japanese politics, it's very common for the LDP to make coalitions with other right-wing parties to form a majority government. And if we follow how the Japanese constitution works, Michinosuke would pretty much need a 2/3 parliamentary supermajority in the lower and upper house to revise anything via referendum. That includes the revision of Article 9 so that Japan can militarize again. That's why he mentions those 200,000 Kaijin votes during Darom's deal, because despite the LDP's stranglehold on Japanese politics, they've historically never had enough representatives in its parliament to hit that supermajority on its own. And as of 2022, it still doesn't.
私はいずれ海外で武力行使できるよう憲法を改正するつもりだ。その時には20万人からなる海人票は役に立つ。
あんた、最初からそれが目的で。
ついでに言えば、他国と戦争になった時、海人には兵器として最前線で活躍してもらう。
If anything, the Gorgom party's cult-like attire and religious aesthetics make them more like the Komeito, a Buddhist-adjacent religious party that works in tandem with the LDP while also keeping them in line if they stray too far right. Also, since I'm comparing Gorgom to the Komeito, did you know that the Komeito was an offshoot of the Soka Gakkai, which is a Buddhist new religious society where if you translate Soka Gakkai, it actually means creation value society, and it makes me think about Soseo in various ways. All in all, Gorgom's transformation from a leftist student group to a center-right coalition party for the LDP was something I didn't see coming, and it almost feels like a case of elite capture. Even though the days of them being Lovecraftian demon lords didn't transfer to Black Sun, I'm glad the creators took this route because to an older Japanese viewer, the dots are just begging to be connected here. It's a bold decision, and it's one that I'm standing by. Part 4, Aoi and Shunsuke are children of the sun. Now let me start this section by saying that I love Aoi and Shunsuke. If you ever needed any reason why Gen Alpha has all the right moves, it's through these two because they're just, I don't know, they're just amazing. Now, Aoi being a Kaijin Greta Thunberg shouldn't be lost on any of you because Greta's ability to shit on anyone who fails to act on climate change is legendary, and I love it. In Black Sun, Aoi is doing Greta proud since the show's edgelords, Donami and Buildup, hate her guts. Aoi isn't just the lead character in Black Sun, however, she's the person with the most character development, and despite everything that she's experienced in these 10 episodes as a teenager, mind you, she remains unwavering to her cause. She's everything that a human being needs to be in these up times, no matter the destination, whether it's a bus stop or a demonstration. Aoi pretty much has your back, and her solidarity with Kaijin is just strong, it's true, and it's genuine. And honestly, it's the kind of stuff I wish I grew up experiencing as an older millennial from a marginalized community. In addition to this, Aoi's parents, her school, her community, her neighborhood, they've all nurtured this. And with regards to her school, it's super obvious that her kaijin-friendly school is doing a great job, since Igaki is seen here blathering on about unpatriotic education in episode 1. Which, just so you know, this does happen in Japan, just in front of Korean elementary schools, because, you know, they're racists. Nowhere is Aoi's love for everyone more evident, however, than with her best pal, Shunsuke. Shunsuke is a key character in Black Sun because he gives us a bird's eye view into everyday life as a kaijin. Even though he's surrounded by a loving family, accepting classmates, and a warm community, he's also subjected to intense racism from either bus patrons or cafe owners. And frankly, the usual stuff he endures from Igaki seems to pale in comparison, but we'll get to that later. And despite all the hate he's subjected to, he and his parents continue to be agitators for change, and that to me is worthy of admiration. All in all, Shunsuke's a good kid, and you can't help but root for him. But that all changes once Nobuhiko's in the picture. After his near-death experience with the Anemone Kaijin, Shunsuke's pretty much swept off by Nobuhiko's grandeur, his bravado, and his awesome speech, and joins his benefactor's cause. Under Nobuhiko's tutelage, our little sparrow toughens up, learns valuable life lessons, and has diarrhea on a racist, Ching. Despite other people's concerns about Shunsuke's growing radicalism, I'd argue that he was pushed into this not only because of Nobuhiko, but because of how god-awful the police are in Black Sun. I mean, just look at this. They're either goading people into violence, killing them with state-sanctioned violence, arresting his working-class dad for peanuts, and, I don't know, not protecting his neighborhood when Igaki shows up. Like, literally, the only time the police ever show up in Shunsuke's neighborhood is when Shunsuke is dead. What the hell is that? And that's after he and Aoi survived a bloodbath at Gorgom HQ. But we'll talk about that later. For now, I just want to end this section with the opinion that Aoi and Shunsuke in Kamen Rider Black Sun represent the future. The team behind the show clearly want older Japanese audiences to understand how much kids endure these days, and how much of an example both Aoi and Shunsuke are setting once their beliefs are tested. Shunsuke might be a timid weakling in Tokusatsu terms, but when push comes to shove, he humiliated security guards, survived the SWAT team bloodbath, helped his best friend at her darkest hour, and told off a racist before he was murdered in broad daylight. On the other hand, Aoi's endured multiple kidnappings, the death of her parents, police violence, the violation of her bodily autonomy, the worst apology in human history, an edgelord looking for forgiveness at the wrong time, 2 dialogues with the UN with one breaking the fourth wall, and the death of her friend, mentor, and hero, Kotaro Minami, by her own hand. And most of all, she lost Shunsuke, her ally, her comrade, and her closest friend. And unlike Nobuhiko, she stayed true to her calling, understands the will of her revolutionary forebears, and most crucially, refused to wallow in nihilism. Part 5, Shadow Moon and Magneto. Speaking of Nobuhiko, aside from Kokoro Hirasawa's amazing performance as Aoi, Tomoya Nakamura kind of stole the show as Shadow Moon. He was amazing, and his passion, charisma, and fury as Nobuhiko was just, I don't know. I think it was one of the standout performances of the show, and it showcased how both a hero and a victim can also become a victimizer. Now, after surviving what amounts to child exploitation and experimentation, Nobuhiko pretty much becomes your average Shonen Jump protagonist by 1972. He's young, dumb, and full of cum, and to him, Gorgom's the best place to let off some socialist steam. And for 50 years after Yukari's death, Nobuhiko's been shackled up in Gorgom's basement as a potential replacement to the Creation King. Once he gets out, however, everything's a party to him, and he's just itching to fight once again, no matter the cost. To him, Gorgom's lost its way, and he's back to slap it back to its senses. Thus, when Aoi's kidnapped, him, Kotaro, and the rest of his faction devise a plan to raid Gorgom HQ. Now, the raid is both a success and a failure, depending on your vantage point. Sure, Aoi's rescued and the Creation King's dismembered, but Nobuhiko's faction is annihilated, the human prisoners are slaughtered, and Kotaro's in bad shape. Nobuhiko survives, of course, but like those that came before him, his raid for great justice ends in defeat. However, none of that could have prepared Nobuhiko for what was awaiting him outside of Shunsuke's house. It's a powerful and tragic scene where we see Nobuhiko, a literal revolutionary in the making, struggling to tell Shunsuke's parents that he might have gotten their son killed, only to find that something far more horrible and far more mundane killed him instead. It is, without question, one of the most tragic scenes in the show, and it's in this moment that we lose Shadow Moon forever. After Igaki becomes Hanbo's helper, Nobuhiko is ready for a different approach. Fueled by despair, fury, and a strong sense of Shonen Jump self-worth, Shadow Moon convinces Gorgom to move away from human coexistence and onto Kaijin supremacy, with Bishum in full agreement. Afterwards, Darum's shanked, Baraon becomes kitty litter, and Nobuhiko ascends to the top of the organization with a new wardrobe. If there was ever a time to use an X-Men analogy, it would be now, because Nobuhiko is now Magneto. And like Magneto, Nobuhiko isn't just driven by despair and fury, but by nihilism, and it's not entirely his fault. If humans, to him, can kill Kaijin with impunity, what's to stop them from wiping Kaijin out entirely? To Nobuhiko, if humans are the dominant predator, what's to stop Kaijin, with all their strength and power, from usurping them? With Shunsuke murdered, his faction shattered, and his years of activism rendered meaningless by racist mobs emboldened by the state, why wouldn't he take the reins of power for himself and wage a war against humanity? Nobuhiko is a tragic figure in Kamen Rider Black Sun that's driven to madness not only because of hate mobs, but he's driven to madness by his own vanity, despair, fury, and nihilism. Because of this, he's not only blinded by the personality cult that he created, but he's unable to perform the sort of introspection that he needs to get out of it. It makes me wonder if Kazuya Shiraishi's commenting on heroes in general, and how this burning Shonen Jump main character syndrome can drive people into madness with the right triggers. And if Shadow Moon of all people can't shake off his Magneto impersonation, what hope do we have for Kotaro? Part 6, Black Sun, Born Anew. In the original TV show, Kotaro's a positive dude waging a one-man war against the horde that is Gorgom. In Kamen Rider Black Sun, he's a sad simp cuck babysitting a snowflake while taking hits from the Special K. Who do I like better? Well, both, actually. Allow me to explain. Kotaro from 1987 was a product of his time. Japan was riding high off of its booming economy, and Kotaro, despite the tragedies that befell him in Kamen Rider Black and RX, encapsulated those positive vibes as the Showa era was nearing its end. Kotaro was all about action and justice, and for many of us older Tokusatsu fans, his imprint on the Kamen Rider franchise was unquestionable. However, things for Kamen Rider and Japan were about to change. As the 90s rolled around, we saw a lot less Kamen Rider except for some specials and Furbus. But what many of us here in the West tend to forget is that by 1992, all those feel-good vibes in Japan kind of popped. I mean, like literally. In 1992, Japan's bubble economy collapsed thanks to a whole load of reasons that I think Yakuza 0 can explain better than I can. But the impact was so bad for the everyday Japanese person that the 90s was considered the lost decade. But that's not all. Japan, for the last 30 or so years, hasn't recovered from this, and this recession has continued to this day, with every decade after that declared a lost one. This real-life socioeconomic disaster now sets the stage for Kamen Rider Black Sun and our present-day Kotaro for 2022. Kotaro in 2022 is by far a more realistic depiction of something that's not often talked about in niche Japanese media, and that's the jaded Japanese leftist. No, he's not Hayao Miyazaki or Osamu Dezaki or even Yoshiyuki Tomino of Gundam fame, but he's kind of his own brand. Now, when we see Kotaro's personality in 1972, he's a bit of a passenger compared to the more driven Nobuhiko, almost as if Nobuhiko is the main character of the story. He seems like a loyal friend, he's super quiet, totally shy, and he doesn't seem to stand out much. And if you remember his hilarious interaction with Oliver during that painting scene, he's kind of a square. And to me, that's very intentional, but more on that later. Fast forward to 2022, and Kotaro is an empty shell of a man who's roughing up his own kind for money, might have offed a guy or two, and loves the sweet embrace of the Special K. His face, his way of walking, and his demeanor all tell you that he's a man that's not only lived through hell, but he's one that's tired of everything. Tired of recession, tired of suffering, tired of people, and most of all, tired of life. He's not that young man waving around a protest sign anymore. He's a hired hand who slit his mom's throat for a nickel. Also, he lives in a bus, and somehow everyone knows where he lives. But all that changes once he meets Aoi. Aoi is key to Kotaro's development in Black Sun because she helps him reconnect with his revolutionary past. It's because of her that he sees that old photo of himself with Gorgom. It's thanks to her that he's with his awesome bike again. It's through her that he remembers Yukari and the Kingstone, and it's through her that he feels the most human he's ever been in 50 years. And if anyone's still wondering why Kotaro hasn't done anything in these last 50 years, let's remember that in 1972, he kidnapped the grandson of a sitting prime minister, survived in the mountains for an indeterminate length of time, tried to kill a super being, got his leg crushed by said super being, was saved by the Batman, and bore witness to both the death of Yukari and the implosion of the political movement that he swore his entire life on due to infighting. Kotaro died that day in 1972, and nothing has mattered to him ever since. If Nobuhiko's nihilism led him to genocidal action, Kotaro's nihilism led him to selfish inaction. In those 50 years, nothing has gotten better for kaijins in Japanese society, and despite all the upheavals, demonstrations, and all the injustice, Kotaro's figurative death is a slow one where he's just ambling on, ignoring the world for the sake of his own survival. If anything, he's like Junichi from Kids on the Slope. You know, that trumpet player who takes part in a socialist student movement, is beaten by fascists, gets disowned by his wealthy family, and drowns himself in booze and smoke because, you guessed it, nothing else matters when you're powerless in your home nation. But like Kotaro, Junichi does find someone to help him live again, and although he isn't a raging kami like I would have wanted him to be, at least he's happy. Kotaro reconnects with his revolutionary past through Aoi, so much so that he's kicking ass, taking names, eating his ancestors, and being the coolest revolutionary on a wheelchair. I mean, he's so back to being a revolutionary that he even hangs up Gorgom's old flag in the background. Hey! And by the time Kotaro rides off for the last time in episode 10, we realize that Kotaro isn't the square, the passenger, or the quiet best friend anymore like he was in 1972. He's now a protector, a father figure, and an inspiration. He is Black Sun, born anew, and he refuses to stand by idly any longer. For me, Kotaro's characterization here in Black Sun is posing a question to those Japanese adults who saw Kamen Rider Black way back in 1987, asking them whether they're content with just ambling along in their lives while a younger, braver, and more diverse Japan is emerging before their very eyes. A Japan that's pushing back against the patriarchy, the gay bashers, the transphobes, the racists, the revisionists, and the old farts who think Japan was always homogenous when it never ever was in the first place. Kotaro is asking all his old fans to stop being passengers like he was, and to stop being selfish. He's asking them to fight for the kids, the progressives, and for the future of a pacifist Japan. Because if they don't, who will? Part 7, the ending. And this finally leads me to the most divisive and most controversial segment of Kamen Rider Black Sun, and it's the ending. But before we talk about that doozy of an ending, let's rewind a bit. In episode 8, Nomi gives Aoi a key that her mother left for her and goes to Oliver's grave in episode 9. In his grave, Aoi finds a locked box that the key opens, where she discovers the cache of info her parents obtained during their time away in China, providing indisputable proof that Kaijin were a product of Imperial Japanese weapons research. If you're disputing the Chinese links to this proof, remember that in episode 1, Aoi is seen on the phone with her parents, telling Misaki that Mom might be returning from China soon, and in episode 3, Komori finds a folder labeled Paiching 2022-1031 in her luggage, containing photos of the Kaijin unit and a reel featuring Michinosuke and the unit at work. Though the folder's name most certainly is of Chinese origin, it's spelled with Whaled Gao's romanization and not Pinyin. In Pinyin, I believe it would be spelled as Baiqing, but I'm not a native Chinese speaker, unfortunately. It might be referencing the ski resort in Shenyang, China in the northeast, but I'm not sure. The only correlation I might have is that unfortunately this area is around the same area as Manchukuo was, along with Unit 731. But again, I'm not a native speaker, so if there's anyone out there that can kind of advise on this, let me know. Aoi, armed with proof that Imperial Japan created Kaijins, goes to the UN and reveals all her findings in episode 9, along with damning footage featuring the elder Donami, leaving everyone stunned, shocked, and filled with the greatest overacting you've ever seen. Oh, and Bill Gainey is dead. Who cares? By episode 10, Japan's opposition parties have Aoi's evidence in a damning pamphlet that's ready to light the LDP's ass on fire. Or that's what we thought. Now, you're probably wondering why the LDP survived such a massive scandal and why Nimura's ascendancy to become prime minister felt so rushed despite 9 episodes of Buildup, the emergence of the Kaijin report, and all the sacrifices that happened to get this intel out in the open. Well, that's by design, so allow me to explain. After getting his ass kicked by the opposition, Donami retreats to a really nice dinner to figure out his next course of action. This is where Donami's buddy, who reminds me of Taro Aso, mentions something super important that'll help us understand the ending. And it's the word Kaisan, or dissolution. Here, he doesn't mean dissolving or disbanding the LDP. What he actually means here is the dissolution of the House of Representatives, or the Parliament's lower house, which, per the Constitution of Japan, will lead to a snap election.
先日の首相発言を受けて解散総選挙の観測が広がる中、与野党内は一転慌ただしい空気に包まれています。
解散は首相が判断することですので、我々はそれに従うだけです。
総理は一体いつ解散のカードを切るのか注目されます。
このタイミングで解散か。ま、野党も足並み揃ってねえし、このまま選挙に打って出りゃどう転んでも与党の対象だな。
Per the Japanese constitution, snap elections have to occur within 40 days of dissolution, whereby all the seats you see here, they're up for grabs. And Shinzo Abe himself has been accused of using snap elections in the past to kind of distract and distance himself from some of his corruption scandals.
「本日午後開かれた衆議院本会議で議長が解散詔書を読み上げ、衆議院は解散しました。
日本国憲法第7条により衆議院を解散する。
万歳！万歳！万歳！万歳！
This is why Donami's friend says, distract the citizens and it'll be old news in no time. Now, after Donami's execution at the hands of Kamen Rider Nick, we fast forward to the aftermath of that snap election and the ascendancy of Nimura as prime minister with a new cabinet filled with old dudes and 3 women, one of them being Bishu. It's only been 40 days or less, and in the blink of an eye, the distraction and media blitz of a snap election has already done its job. And since the LDP was the ruling party amidst the snap election, they still have the power to choose who the next prime minister will be. The Kaijin revelations did little to nothing to sway the average Japanese voter to turn their backs on the LDP, and the reins of power are back with them and Gorgom, which is not uncommon in Japan. And now we find ourselves in another divisive scene for Kamen Rider Black Sun, and it's the George Floyd reference. For the many fans of Tokusatsu outside of Japan that found this reference triggering and or offensive, please know that this is a valid critique, and it's one that deserves empathy, space, and understanding. Anti-blackness is a global scourge that even East Asia is guilty of perpetuating, and we as Asian diaspora people need to be cognizant about this. The reason why Kamen Rider Black Sun has this very triggering scene in the first place has a lot to do with how Japan views racism overall, so allow me to explain. As we discussed earlier in part 1 of this video, the 2010s in Japan was rife with racist demonstrations against Zainichi Koreans and other Asian minorities, and it required a great deal of pushback from smaller anti-racist collectives. George Floyd protests in Japan were led by Black American expats in the middle of the pandemic, and though many in the picket stands weren't all Japanese, you can't exactly say that they didn't participate. This led to a wider discussion about an issue that many expats and Japanese liberals have noticed about Japan, and it's the fact that in Japan, racism is viewed as an American problem and not a Japanese one.
So at the high school I was teaching at, I did a little lesson on racism and discrimination. I showed the Eye of the Storm, which you can find in my video channel.
I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are.
I highly recommend watching it if you haven't already. After the video, I asked my students to raise their hands if they thought there was any racism or discrimination in Japan.
日本では人種差別あると思う人、手を挙げてください。
And in every class, only 2 or 3 students out of 40 raised their hands.
人種差別あると思う人、1人、2人。Okay. 少ないね。
After that, I asked them to raise their hands if they thought racism and discrimination were strictly an American problem. And without fail, in every class, 90% of the students raised their hands. I think there's a huge problem with that. My students learn about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in school and see on the news that America has a huge problem with racism and discrimination. But where are the school lessons and news stories about discrimination in Japan? Why don't my students think that there is racism and discrimination in Japan? Do I believe there's racism and discrimination in Japan? Of course I do.
Both NPR and the BBC have covered this in 2020, but long story short, even if there are Japanese liberals, anti-racist activists, and leftists who agree that Japan has serious issues with anti-blackness, none of it is enough to sway the average Japanese person who stubbornly leans conservative to see that it's an actual intersectional issue that bleeds into how Japan views homosexuality, domestic discrimination against Japan's ethnic minorities like the Ainu, Okinawans, and Burakumin, discrimination against other Asians, and discrimination against specific sections of biracial Japan. After the George Floyd protests gained visibility in Japan, NHK, Japan's national broadcaster, aired an info segment about the Black Lives Matter movement that was rife with racist caricatures and offensive stereotypes. The whole world was incensed by this, including teacher, author, and cultural critic Bai McNeill, who's lived in Japan for almost 20 years. Bai McNeill did not hold back, and after he wrote a series of articles and tweets denouncing the NHK segment, the NHK issued an apology and he was invited to the station to lead a sobering talk about the incident with their staff. When asked by the BBC about his reflections on being black in Japan overall, Bai mentioned that it isn't too dissimilar to how biracial Japanese are viewed in Japan because, as he puts it, you're otherized on a daily basis. Adding that, biracial Japanese have a different experience according to what they are mixed with. The ones mixed with whites are the ones who get the modeling contracts and are put on a pedestal, but it's a very different story if you're half Korean or half black. The BBC also interviewed two of Bai McNeill's students in 2020 about anti-black racism in Japan, and one student, Hitomi, had this to say: "The Japanese media presented Black Lives Matter as just an American problem. There might be a slight change in consciousness now, but visible change is a long way off."
I think the movement is still starting, especially because a lot of times people don't see that systematic racism is a problem in Japan, especially because in Japan sometimes problems that aren't seen aren't considered a real problem.
Please follow the police instructions and proceed as advised.
I think the main problem regarding racism in Japan is that people don't necessarily realize that it's a problem.
A lot of my friends are in the US, like fighting for this, going to protests, like just in the midst of it, and I couldn't just stand around. And I heard about this movement and this group. I helped translate some stuff, and I just did whatever I could because not a lot of Japanese people understand what this is. Japan needs to almost step it up because right now they haven't even criminalized hate speech. There's a lot of hidden racism here in Japan, so I just want to maybe bring that more to the forefront in Japan as well.
日本での差別の問題はたくさんあると思います。結構有名ですけど、電車の中で隣に座らないとか、もっとその社会を良くするためにはやっぱり尊敬、リスペクトするってことが大事だなと思ってます。
Being vocal is something that we should all learn. Being vocal doesn't mean you are bringing unrest. You're causing trouble. No. It's because you are standing for cause. If you ignore it, then it just keeps getting worse. And I think that ignoring is what happens sometimes here. But I think we can learn to stand up for whatever cause we stand for.
To that end, Black Sun's George Floyd reference is very much aimed at those in Japan who think that state-sanctioned violence and over-policing are strictly American problems that only Black Americans face, and that none of that will ever happen in Japan. It's a cautionary segment that's demanding Japanese viewers to look beyond what they've been told regarding racism and police violence, and that not only can those things happen in Japan, but it can and will happen thanks to Japanese police who are tasked with enforcing a baseless notion of order and homogeneity in the name of a very conservative Japan. And speaking of cautionary tales, let's finally sit down and talk about Aoi's part in that ending. After the George Floyd reference, we now have a shot featuring a demonstration about an immigration policy which probably helped the LDP gain more seats in that recent snap election. In the middle of it all is that young girl with her protest sign, once again referencing Shinokubo and Korean solidarity. However, she's knocked down by a passerby and her sign is stepped on, which we'll get to later. This happens not that long after Prime Minister Nimura says this to Bishu: "If you allow humans to let off a bit of steam, they don't notice the inconveniences. They don't notice the pain. They misguidedly think it's peaceful and loyally serve our country." Donami made a mistake when he lined his own pockets instead of inheriting his grandfather's will. But I'm different. This quote sets the stage for what we're going to see next when Aoi takes the little girl across this field lined with the graves of her fellow activists. And as the camera pans across these graves, cut to Nomi training other like-minded kids in combat as if they're preparing for war. Now, if we re-examine the montage closely, the ages you're seeing here are at the very least under 16, which is interesting given that in 2016, Japan finally lowered its voting age from 20 to 18. And remember, Aoi is 14. Now, I understand if folks feel that this segment is emblematic of this vicious, never-ending cycle where the good guys become as bad as the bad guys, but right now I want to focus your attention to the new segment featuring Prime Minister Nimura right here. In this new segment, Nimura's making an impassioned plea to basically amend Article 9 of the Constitution because, and I'm paraphrasing it here, we can't depend on our allies, we need to be strong again, and strength is what we'll need to fight against everyday evil, blah 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 bullshit. It's a scene that's both poignant and ironic given what's been going on with Aoi in the background, but for a Japanese viewer, Nimura's news segment is bad news because if you translate the news chyron up here, it literally says War Bill Referendum, implying that the LDP finally got that 2/3 majority and they're going to put this very unpopular, life-changing legislation to a vote. Now, if you've been paying attention to Kamen Rider Black Sun, you'll know that Michinosuke Donami's true aim was to basically create a docile army of augmented super soldiers, right? Well, all that changed when the Empire lost the war and Japan was essentially demilitarized. By the time Gorgom negotiates with Michinosuke in 1972, the elder Donami's plan has now become an electoral one, with the amendment of Article 9 at the center of it all. Nimura, who sees himself as Michinosuke's successor, is now head of the nation, and since his party was given a lifeline thanks to Japan's electorate, he's gonna ram this war bill referendum through because, as we've seen in episode 3, the LDP doesn't give a f*** about the will of the people. Remember when the young girl was pushed down to the ground during her protest and somebody stepped on her sign? During my second rewatch of the show, I noticed that Kazuya Shiraishi's direction really emphasized the actions of its background characters and extras. Obvious examples include the protest girl at episode 10, but also with Shiraishi himself, the racists at a kaijin-less Samezu Yokocho, and anything to do with the racist demonstrators. But I'm having this tangent here to point out something very key in Black Sun, and it's found here in episode 7. In this scene, all the death and chaos from the Gorgom raid has finally gotten to Shunsuke as he finds himself by the edge of the river, almost as if he's staring at the Sanzu no Kawa. He's clearly in pain and he needs to cry. And in the background, you'll see many older folks walking past him, clearly seeing that Shunsuke is in tumult and pain, and they're just walking by. Once Aoi senses that something's wrong, 2 or 3 people have already noticed him and did nothing. Aoi soon comes to Shunsuke, embraces him, and they cry together. These 2 kids, who can't even vote mind you, have just survived a state-sanctioned massacre, and no one is there to even break from their routine to just check in to see if they're okay. We see these instances of everyday apathy throughout the show, obviously, but episode 7 is what really puts it into focus when Shunsuke is being accosted by these guys. If we see here, here, and here, there were so many bystanders that could have done something to stop the madness. And people either walked on or, like this guy in the suit, pretended to not see anything at all, which is a lot like what we're seeing here, here, and yes, here. I'm of the opinion that Kazuya Shiraishi is deliberately focusing on the actions of his background characters to kind of highlight this visible apathy that's peppered throughout the show. Shunsuke's death could have been averted if someone intervened, and Aoi, a person who can't even vote, wouldn't have to resort to what we're seeing here if older working adults followed through with their outrage from the Kaijin report by turning their backs on the LDP during the snap election. This unchecked apathy not only kept the LDP in power, but in Kamen Rider Black Sun, it helped to maintain Kaijin discrimination by episode 10. And it's this everyday apathy that allows the LDP that we see in Black Sun to perform heinous acts of fascism on the regular. This divisive ending is yet another cautionary tale to older Japanese viewers, warning them that if they don't show up and do battle on the ballot box, then they're leaving it to their children and grandchildren to do battle without it. And unfortunately, this mirrors... Alright guys, you're probably wondering why I'm making this bold interruption / addendum when we're talking about the electorate in Japan. Now, I just want to clarify that I am not trying to blame all of this on Japan's youth when it comes to voting. As everyone knows, Japan's going through a demographic crisis, and unfortunately, voters 60 and over kind of have more power here. But it's really easy to assume or to project that, oh, all of this is because Japan's young voters don't want to vote. Well, let me be clear, it's not their fault. Jill Steele, a political scientist from Doshisha University, was interviewed in October 2021 by NPR's Anthony Kuhn, and she had this to say, which I found really interesting.
Jill Steele, a political scientist at Doshisha University in Kyoto, says apathy is not the youth's fault. Instead, she argues, it's partly the result of a strategy that discourages political participation.
The Japanese state has cultivated or even mandated an atmosphere of depoliticization that discourages citizen interest and engagement.
It includes jargon-filled political platforms, yawn-inducing political reporting by Japanese media, and education which generally discourages political debate and protest. That's too bad, Steele says.
There are all sorts of exciting ways to teach politics, even to the youngest children in elementary school, to connect decisions that get made to their own interest. And here it's just not allowed and not considered.
Steele admits that there are bright spots and occasional pockets of activism.
And these pockets of activism also include people that we've talked about earlier in this video, including our anti-racist demonstrators from Kawasaki, Tokyo, and throughout Japan. Furthermore, Japan's youth are a lot more progressive than we in the West care to admit. As Jill Steele points out,
many progressive youth, though, find the LDP anything but refreshing. Jill Steele notes that it's against LGBTQ rights, feminism, and immigration, and more than 90% of LDP candidates in this election are male.
The movement of the country as a whole is to being more progressive on social issues. So for the LDP to be clinging on to these policies is not a good look.
However, one of the big issues as to why the LDP keeps coming back into power is really because the LDP kind of focuses on a lot of bread and butter issues. As Anthony Kuhn notes, instead, the LDP focuses on bread and butter issues. Those are more important to voters 60 and over who outnumber the youth. So yeah, it's kind of rough being a young progressive in Japan, and I just want to make sure that I didn't conflate Japanese leftists and progressives, especially young ones, with everybody else. Back to the video. And unfortunately, this mirrors how fascism is slowly creeping into all our lives today, including the lives of Asians in Asia. Whether it's via South Korea's new president, to what we're seeing in Myanmar, Iran, Thailand, India, the Philippines, and even with Indonesia's new law against premarital sex and cohabitation, fascist policies are on the rise in Asia, and the Japan of Kamen Rider Black Sun is on the verge of making Japan imperial again. And if you're still not convinced by this, let me play you a clip from a movie featuring an activist that was born, raised, jailed, and eventually murdered in my hometown.
It's not a question of violence or non-violence. It's a question of resistance to fascism or non-existence within fascism. You can murder a liberator, but you can't murder liberation. You can murder a revolutionary, but you can't murder revolution.
Now, did you get that? That bit in the beginning? If not, let's play that again.
It's not a question of violence or non-violence. It's a question of resistance to fascism or non-existence within fascism.
Yeah, that's Daniel Kaluuya as Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party from the 2021 film Judas and the Black Messiah. And everything he just said is literally what I was getting ready for, because in Black Sun, almost every single democratic avenue to avert Nimura's efforts have now been exhausted. Nimura says he wants peace, but he's literally rearming Japan and putting Kaijin in the front lines. It almost makes me think about one of Fred Hampton's quotes right here.
Black people need some peace. White people need some peace. And we are going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly to bring about some peace, because the people that we're asking for peace, they're a bunch of megalomaniac warmongers, and they don't even understand what peace means. And we've got to fight them. We've got to struggle with them to make them understand what peace means.
And if you still think that Black Sun is only about these vicious, never-ending cycles where no one's a victor, then let's talk about some, because they're all over the show. And as we've witnessed in 10 episodes, things tend to repeat themselves again and again. From protest movements, to escalated incidents featuring left-wing activists, to what happens to Kotaro, so much of Black Sun's repetitions occur because the folks with the power to change things either fail or are thwarted at key moments, and that burden to fight for change becomes the can that gets kicked down the street until the next time, and the next time, and the next time. And all the while, we as Tokusatsu fans are kind of lulled into thinking that the terrible actions of a teenager is equal to or greater than the actions of Donami and Nimura and Gorgom, the police, the SWAT team, and the entire Heat Heaven production apparatus. I mean, these things are done on the regular throughout the show. And if you want a real world parallel about vicious cycles, let me give you this. For many scholars in Japan, the recent demonstrations against Zainichi Koreans are said to be part of a broader issue when Japan emerges from the aftermath of a terrible natural disaster. For the demonstrations that we've seen recently, much of this discontent stemmed from the false claim that after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, Zainichi Koreans were unfairly claiming disaster relief funds that should be prioritized to Japanese victims. However, this is not the first time Zainichi Koreans have been scapegoated in the aftermath of a disaster. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 was the deadliest of that year, with an estimated magnitude of 8.2, which killed approximately 186,000 people. It's a tragedy that's so ingrained in Japanese society that September 1st, the day of the earthquake, was designated as Disaster Prevention Day in 1960. Furthermore, the Kanto earthquake legacy continues to live on in books, media, manga, and yes, even anime. But what isn't talked about enough is the violence that ensued after the earthquake. The Kanto massacre of 1923 was an event where Koreans were beaten, harassed, deported, and murdered by mobs of Japanese who were riled up by rumors that Koreans and socialists were taking advantage of Japanese disaster victims with robbery and arson. And yes, this is a photo of two Japanese men standing over the corpse of an ethnic Korean. The number of victims is disputed, however, with conservative numbers ranging in the hundreds, while other estimates place it in the thousands. Chinese, Okinawans, and even Japanese who spoke different dialects were also harassed, beaten, or killed because they were mistaken as Korean. As one reporter put it, a Korean's life wasn't worth a plugged nickel that night. They were bumped off when they were found, beaten to death with clubs, hacked to pieces with swords, pierced with spears. Just to be Korean or to be a Japanese Red or socialist was sufficient to sign a summary death warrant at the hands of the roaming bands of frenzied loyalists. And it's not just Koreans and other ethnicities that were affected by this too. The Kameto incident soon occurred in September 3rd, where the Kameto police of Tokyo arrested labor activists and union leaders under fears that they would spread disorder during the Kanto earthquake's aftermath in an attempt to overthrow the government. And since Korea's independent movement started to gather strength during that time, Koreans and Chinese were thrown into the mix too. Hell, even a prominent labor leader was beheaded by an army unit in the process. To many Japanese history buffs, the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 and the violence against socialists and ethnic minorities that followed was a telltale sign that the Empire of Japan was drifting closer and closer towards outright fascism. And this cycle of anger, denial, violence, and scapegoating has continued to this day. And remember, the Kanto massacre was almost 100 years ago. This is now January of 2023. With all this in mind, Kamen Rider Black Sun, in my opinion, isn't some allegory about how power corrupts heroes and villains. It's not a shock piece for liberal snowflakes, nor is it really an exploration about the never-ending cycle of violence. Kamen Rider Black Sun is literally the riskiest show I've ever seen from Japanese television, and it's one that drops all the metaphors and nuance we've grown way too accustomed to from RPGs, from Jidaigeki shows, from Tokusatsu shows, and from all kinds of other Japanese media, and just says, "F it, here's Japanese history, warts and all." It's a massive middle finger pointed towards the revisionists, the conservatives, the bigots, and the war criminals of modern Japan that continue to rule the nation unopposed to this day. It's a valiant attempt at melding leftism with genre action, and most of all, it's a cautionary tale meant to test our understanding of what fascism actually is, what evil actually is. Because if we walked away thinking what Aoi is doing is evil, then we've done what fascism's always done, and that's to falsely assume that whatever violence she and other minorities might elicit will be equal to or greater than whatever these guys have actually done throughout the show. Donami, Nimura, Biogenia, and Gorgom have an official state-sanctioned monopoly on violence, full stop. And they've demonstrated this to full effect in each episode. And if that isn't fascism to you, then you probably haven't been paying attention in history class, because everything that these kids are terrified of in Black Sun is kind of in the works in Japan as we speak. In July of 2014, the Abe government actually allowed for a reinterpretation of Article 9 to allow for collective self-defense, and in some cases to engage in military action if any of its allies were under threat. This was criticized heavily because it wasn't approved by the usual 2/3 supermajority vote of both the upper and lower house to go through for a referendum, like all other amendments. This is kind of why I found myself chuckling during the war bill deliberation of episode 3. The opposition party is calling the bill what it is, while Nimura reinterprets this as the peaceful security legislation, which is total BS. The 2014 reinterpretation of Article 9 seems to have given the LDP a mandate on splashing the cash, because in December of 2022, Fumio Kishida, the LDP's new prime minister, proposed a 5-year, $320 billion spending plan to ramp up its defenses with missiles, planes, and whatever else the kids are into these days. However, he plans to fund some of this by jacking up income taxes, which is totally hilarious since no one in Japan will dig that, especially the conservatives. All in all, Kamen Rider Black Sun isn't the tokusatsu show that Japan needs right now, but because of the LDP, it certainly is the show that Japan's conservatives deserve. The LDP's ineptitude, discriminatory attitudes, and overall backwardness, along with its desire to militarize again, has been hovering over the heads of ordinary Japanese for the longest time, and Kamen Rider Black Sun pulls no punches when it shows its overt disdain for that. It's a Japanese TV show that's seeking an honest discussion, with its middle finger pointed directly at the nation's ruling elite. And lastly, it's the only tokusatsu show that I've ever seen that's echoed one of Frederick Douglass's most famous quotes through Aoi Izumi, which is, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them, and these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Aoi is making that demand because everything she worked for in 9 episodes was quashed. Quashed not just because of the LDP, but because of the bystanders, the workaholics, and the many people just moseying on by while they're being crushed by capitalism in Japan throughout the entire show. And these folks have been inculcated to watch, to walk away, and most of all, to pretend nothing is happening. If anything, Black Sun's politics is so divisive amongst us because it's really showing us in real time the limits to what Henshin heroes can actually accomplish. Because in the end, an Ultraman can't negotiate for better housing practices, a Sentai team can't bring up a meaningful discussion about a violent cult, and a Kamen Rider sure as hell can't tell you to stand up to your superior who tried to sexually assault you. It's up to all of us to work together in order to dismantle the systems that oppress us. It's up to us to show up when it's time to vote crooks out of the office. It's up to us to intervene when someone is experiencing discrimination in broad daylight. It's up to us to listen when a victim of sexual violence speaks up. And it's up to us to stand in solidarity with someone when their rights are being quashed right in front of you. Henshin heroes don't do that. We do that together. Because for all of us Tokusatsu fans, Evil wears a cape and has a claw for a hand, right? Evil might look really strong and intimidating and brooding. Hell, I mean, Evil might even have a giant robot. But what happens if Evil is the cop who questions your citizenship even though you were born and raised in Japan? What if Evil holds racist demonstrations on a regular basis in front of your school? What if Evil governs you unopposed for close to 50 years with no progress? And what happens if Evil becomes mundane, becomes commonplace, and ultimately gets ignored? The tagline for Kamen Rider Black Sun isn't a coincidence because it's literally asking us this question here. Who is evil? What is evil? By the end of Kamen Rider Black Sun, Aoi understands this as she looks at a horizon emblazoned with the flag of her new movement. We'll never know if she'll succeed, but we all know that, live or die, she's determined to continue what Kotoro's inspired her to do. To sum up this ending, I think Fred Hampton said it best.
Because school is not important and work is not important. Nothing's more important than stopping fascism because fascism will stop us all.
Well guys, thanks so much for staying to the end of the video. That's all I got for you, really. That's all I got. I want to thank you, the viewer, for staying and enduring all of this for so long. I know this was a huge info dump, so let me know if you have any questions on the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you, and if there's any issues you had with how I made the video, let me know. This is kind of a new thing for me, so it helps me to learn, it helps me to get better. So let me know down in the comment section below. I also want to thank my wife for being such a huge inspiration and for just pushing me to get this out. She's been a big supporter of the channel, so babe, thank you so much. I also want to thank a lot of people from Japan and a lot of expats who live in Japan and speak the language for enlightening me on this very real subject. First off, I need to thank Azuto Danger for pointing out Yasumichi Noma to me. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have reached out to them and I wouldn't have learned as much as I learned about all the anti-racist demonstrations that happened in Japan. I also want to thank Yasumichi Noma and Koichi Yasuda for kind of talking to me on their YouTube channel about this. It was really interesting and I've learned so much. So thank you. Oh, I also want to thank Kazuma Hashimoto for his CIA article. That was a really eye-opening article, so you all should read that. I want to thank Sarah Hightower as well for all her Tokusatsu tweets and all her other musings about life in Japan. She's a really cool person to follow on Twitter, so I hope you guys give her a chance. She had some really good tweets about the origins of Heat Heaven and its connection with a Unit 731 blood bank, along with Professor Akizuki, who might have been inspired by Unit 731 dude Shiroishi. But I can't find those tweets anymore. But again, Sarah, thank you. I also want to thank Miki Dezaki for being such an awesome person and for letting me use some of his footage. Definitely go watch Shisenjo as soon as you can. I also want to thank Bai McNeil for being such an awesome person and for really illuminating how hard it is to be a black man in Japan, or how hard it is to be an African American or an African diaspora person in Japan. If you are ever interested in learning more about him, check out his Twitter, check out his YouTube, and check out his many articles on the Japan Times, BBC, and etc. and etc. Lastly, I want to thank all these other people on Twitter and on YouTube, all of these folks that I'm talking about right now, that I'm showing you guys right now. They are all wonderful people. They're wonderful Japanese leftists that I think we in the West should really reach out to more, especially when we want to talk about Japanese pop culture or anime or manga or just Japanese news in general, because there is so much that we actually don't know about, and the people that actually live there or people that actually speak the language are just instrumental in spreading awareness about these real issues about Japan and kind of parsing through and translating these things for us, because there's so much that we in the West lose in translation, and if it wasn't for these folks, I wouldn't have made this video, okay? And lastly, I hope you guys got something out of the politics of Kamen Rider Black Sun, and I hope that you guys see the value and the inherent leftism that's baked into the show. I hope you guys who haven't watched it, check it out, and I hope you guys that have watched it and were miffed by it, I hope you guys give it a second chance. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you again next time.